Hey, this is Amanda Dery, also known as AF Dery, and I wanted to talk a little about some of my books today. This video is going to be about broken mirrors. um, this is an older version of the cover. If you were to buy it today, you would get a different cover. I'm sure you can't tell, but I did the typography on this one. Don't worry, the one for sale is better. So first off, what do I write about? I am a fantasy author. I write very character-driven fiction. Most of my books have an element of romance in them. I don't really consider myself a romance author, though. Not due to any stigma on the genre. It's just a matter of my stories have very strong fantasy elements, and it's my favorite. It's what I love to do, and so this particular book is the first book in a two-book series, which I call duology, and it does have a post-quill novella that ties up a couple minor loose threads that were present in the second book, but and that's it. So what is it about? Well, the copy is on the back says, "What good is a broken mirror?" That's what Thane, Dreadlord of Eladria, is about to find out when one named Kisera ends up working in his keep. His reflection is far from the ugliest thing she has seen in her life, and the worst is yet to come. With the world around them in turmoil, old alliances crumbling, and a traitor in their midst, the only hope they have to survive is to find each other and pick up the broken pieces before all is lost. Now, I'm really bad at writing descriptions for these books. I think I'm getting better over time, but not the best. But I think that one serves. So I'm going to be reading to you today the first two scenes from this book. You can also use the look inside option on Amazon if you would rather read a portion from the first chapter. It's a very long book, so your look inside will be pretty long. So, Chapter 1. Doom can come in many forms, Kisera knew, but a tea tray was not the one she'd expected for herself. Both the tray in question, laden down with the tea things and what appeared to be a veritable mountain of scones, and her feet felt like they were made of lead as she shuffled up the many shallow stone steps that spiraled up to the Dreadlord's tower, hugging the walls. There could have been 100 or more for all she knew. She'd never counted them. They'd never even gone all the way to the top before. The muscles in her legs already ached in protest, and she was not halfway up yet. The air in the stairwell was so cold and damp as she ascended that she could barely see through the cloud of steam that rose from scones on the tray, but she dared not set it down on the narrow steps or slow her pace. Dawdling while delivering the Dreadlord's tea was simply not an option. Kisera tried to look ahead to the top of the stairs, but it was nowhere in sight. Like the rest of the sprawling keep, all was weather-beaten stone, as gray and bleak as the sky stretching over it. Milky light filtered in through the slit-shaped breaks in the walls that she supposed were meant to be windows. It was overcast more days than not in Eladria, the sun forbearing to smile on the mountainous little country, rocks and mines, dirt and rain. Why the hell did I come here? Kisera wondered for the 1000th time. The answer promptly flashed through her mind. The brief but vivid image of the cloister she'd fled from, along with a remembered echo of screams that had long since died, the throats that had issued them. Yes, she thought, trudging up the endless stair. There are worse things than this, worse places. This high up in the tower occupied only by his lordship, there was none of the ornament that could be seen in the other parts of the keep, if it could rightly be called ornamentation to begin with. Weapons, mostly, polished to a brilliant sheen and always kept sharp enough to be used fresh off the wall if need be, along with some tasteful, if very old, tapestries. She She had often wondered since coming here what that said about Eladria's present ruler. If the decor he chose for the keep reflected him, he too would be both sharp and very old. Never before had Cassera actually seen the Dreadlord of Eladria, as he was properly titled. She was not even certain what one had to do to earn the appellation Dread. She knew he was a warlord, knew the Eladrian army was considered to be without equal, much like the extensive mines that kept them in coin. She also knew that he fought alongside his own troops and that military service was compulsory here for all men. Yet many of those soldiers remained even past the time of their obligatory service of their own volition. Some only for part of each year, others continually until age or battle forced an end to it. She couldn't comprehend the devotion these men displayed to their lord, speaking of him as they did in the hushed tones usually reserved for deities. But perhaps the most compelling and relevant thing she knew about him as a lowly servant in his keep is that he was known for having moods. There were only certain servants permitted to attend him in his private chambers, and she, a refugee from Yatar, was certainly not one of those. No, she usually scrubbed stone floors and cleaned out hearths and laid fires, often in rooms no one ever saw. Only Eladrians occupied the positions of any real value. But she was frankly not any better suited to any of those, and had it not been for the recent ague that had managed to invade not only Eladria but also her keep, she never would have been hired at all. But times were desperate. When it came to reliable domestic management in the keep, it would seem, and even without references, she had been entrusted with her scrub brushes, and a couple months after that, her very own bit of flint, to use in laying the fires. It had been solemnly presented to her by cook with all the pomp and significance of a young soldier's first sharpened blade. Use it well, with our trust, the stout woman had intoned gravely, staring down intently into Cassera's eyes as if seeking one last opportunity to ferret any warning of evil tidings from the younger woman's soul. Thank you, madam, Cassera had said slowly. I appreciate this opportunity to prove my worth with this, piece of flint. At Cook's continued expectant stare, she'd added nervously, this very fine piece of flint. Indeed, thought Cassera wryly, that blessed day when I am allowed to polish the cutlery will no doubt be hailed with a toast of ale in the attendance of the entire staff, if I live long enough to see that day, anyhow. She swallowed hard as she finally stepped up onto an oval-shaped landing. Before her stood an immense and ornate door that looked to be carved from solid oak, with a pair of fully armed and armored soldiers standing before it. Like all natives of Eladria, they were as big and sturdily built as oxen. Between the two of them, the door appeared only as a slim line of dark wood. The guards did not even look directly at Cassera, but at the space right above her head. She sighed, all too accustomed to the sleight of eyes that could never seem to find her. She only came to the shoulders of most of the women, never mind the men. She renewed her grip on the tea tray and tried to slow her breathing, hastened as it was by both her sudden urge of anxiety and the long trudge up the stairs. She was uncertain of what to expect now that she was finally here. She knew Cook had ordered her to take up this tea tray to get rid of her. She had been hired out of desperation only, but Eladrians as a rule were too lawfully minded to have kicked her out when the other servants recovered sufficiently to resume work. No, they had waited until there was a valid reason for her dismissal, and when after 8 long months none was forthcoming, they'd manufactured one. If she displeased the Dreadlord, which her very appearance there guaranteed, she would be dismissed if she survived the experience, and if she refused to go out of self-preservation, she'd be dismissed for her disobedience. It was a solution so elegant in simplicity that Cassera would have admired it under other circumstances, such as circumstances that did not involve her as the subject. There was no point delaying the inevitable any longer. If the tea managed to cool, she was done for no matter what. I've come with my lord's tea, Cassera murmured humbly, dropping her eyes from the soldiers' expressionless faces. The one to her right gave her a long, appraising look. You're not his usual servant of a morning, the man commented in a low voice. No, sir, she said. If she hadn't feared something dropping off the tray, she would have shrugged. How am I to know Cook meant for you to come? Cassera's eyes flicked back up to the soldier, half expecting a belligerent grin, but instead seeing his mouth set in a grim line. Bloody Eladrian paranoia, she thought, barely suppressing the urge to roll her eyes. Are you suggesting I could spirit away Cook's tea tray with my skull intact, sir? She tried to keep her voice humble. but somehow her tone managed to convey her true sentiments of the soldier's intelligence anyhow. He narrowed his eyes, and she braced herself for trouble. "Where the bloody hell is my tea?" It was a deep, rumbling voice resembling more than slightly the roar of an irate bear, sufficiently loud to cut through the thick wood of the door and the heavy stone of the tower walls. He made the back of Casera's neck prickle. She bit her lip, feeling her cheeks cooling faster than the tea as the blood drained from her face. Without another word, the soldier who had addressed her smirked his vindication and opened the door with a great shove and a mocking half-bow. As quickly as she'd paled, she now flushed, but she dared not delay any longer. She strode quickly inside the tower, pressing the edge of the tray firmly against her chest to still its traitorous rattling in her hands. Anne came to a dead stop just as quickly as the soldier pulled the door closed behind her, and darkness closed in around her like a shroud. It wasn't the same darkness as the overcast morning outside. It was pitch blackness. If there were windows, and she was sure there must be, they must have been heavily curtained indeed, for not a single sliver of daylight managed to pierce the room's interior, and there were no lights, not so much as a single candle lit. Casera blinked rapidly as her eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, trying desperately to make out what was around her. This is insane, she thought. Why would anybody in their right mind be sitting around in a pitch-black room waiting for their tea? She realized then that he may not even be in the same room. The tower was undoubtedly large enough to be comprised of several of them. This thought made his lung capacity seem all the more impressive, for she heard him so clearly outside the closed door. But surely, if he were in here, he would say something. "My lord?" she said tentatively into the darkness. After a few agonizingly long and silent moments, she tried again, as loudly as she dared. "My lord?" She winced as it managed to come out as a squeak. Casera heard a door creak open, and a small shift in her vision up ahead told her that there were indeed multiple rooms. "In here," the same low voice she'd heard before hissed impatiently, sounding strained but a good deal quieter. Casera felt torn. On the one hand, she was sorely tempted to point out that she couldn't see. Perhaps he'd allow her to light a candle or something. On the other hand, where would she even find one in the dark? And she certainly didn't want him to start yelling again. Deciding inaction was the greatest of all the perceived evils, she started to move cautiously towards where she thought she'd heard the creaking door. After 3 or 4 rather shuffling steps and grazing her hip on what felt like a table edge, it struck her with the suddenness of a lightning bolt. Pain, and yet not pain. It was the honey-thick heaviness, the tension, the pressure of pain without the actual hurt, and it slapped uncomfortably against her senses, demanding her full attention. She could tell by its persistence and strength that it was not negligible as most people would judge these things. Casera's own scale was a little different. It took a lot to unhinge her. Still, it seemed to gnaw at her hungrily, begging for her to draw near it, to touch it. "No, I will not." She shoved back the sensation without another thought and continued to inch forward, striking her shin on something and almost spilling the tray when her elbow whacked something else, until somewhere about 3/4 of the way to where the creaking had come from, the tray was abruptly snatched from her hands. She let out a little cry of surprise and stumbled back a step, thrown momentarily off balance, but quickly regained her footing. "Scones," the voice groaned. She could not help but notice that it sounded as if his voice was coming from where she imagined the ceiling to be. How tall was this man? Suddenly she heard something breaking somewhere over to her left, and she cringed, ducking her head out of self-protective reflex, even though by that time anything aimed at her head would have already met its mark. Then she heard a sudden rush of pounding steps, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of retching. Casera frowned. She had thought the scones smelled delicious, and there had certainly been a lot of them. Now relieved of her burden, she was free to flee, but unsure if she was supposed to. The retching continued from somewhere ahead of her, and she wondered whether she ought to call for help. She moved hesitantly toward the sounds, and all doubt left her about the origin of the pain she had sensed. It was him. She was sure of it now. The sensation felt like a tangible force now as she edged towards him. It snaked out to her with greedy fingers, making it harder and harder to breathe. She reached down a hand carefully to make sure she was not about to run into anything, and her fingertips grazed what suspiciously felt like the metal hinge of a door. Impulsively, she fumbled around for a handle, and finding one, pulled it open with both hands, allowing a small shaft of wan gray light into the room. She blinked against it furiously and saw the back of a great giant hulk of a man on the floor before her. bent over something. Hopefully a basin, she thought. After all, if she was the only servant around, she might well be drafted into cleanup duty. She shuddered a little at the thought. The man, no doubt the dreadlord himself, did not react to the light, but continued to be noisily sick. Cassara's long experience in sick rooms inured her from the unpleasantness, and concern overriding her instinct for self-preservation, she hastened to his side. The ague had come and gone by now, but was it possible he had contracted it somehow, or was this the result of the pain, or did he just really not like scones? She could see he was trembling and dripping sweat in a spreading stain that darkened the gray tunic covering his back. Long, lank strands of dark red hair fell around his face. She held it back with steady hands, and he jerked at the contact, but otherwise occupied, forbore to react further. He felt hot, but she knew that did not necessarily mean much in the throes of vomiting. When he had finally stilled, she drew one hand away, and again on impulse, lifted the edge of her apron and gently dried his face, though he still kept it turned away from her, panting for breath. Then he did look up, and her stomach plummeted straight to her knees as red-rimmed brown eyes locked hers. The anguish in them was palpable. It made her wince in sympathy. Then she noticed the rest of his face, and felt her own eyes widen. The dreadlord of Eladria was deformed. She wasn't sure how else to describe it. The man was clearly huge, even in comparison with his Eladrian kin, and of course his head and face were sized accordingly, but his mouth, dear gods, his mouth. It was a long, misshapen gash across the bottom half of his face, with thin, bloodless lips that barely stretched closed over the large, sharp teeth, the massive jaw. A long, thin scar, pale as moonlight, slashed through one corner of that mouth from just under his cheekbone down to his chin. Never in her life had she seen such a face. His nose looked otherwise normal, if many times previously broken, and his eyes. Her gaze returned to his, and she wondered if he had not blinked the whole time she was staring at the rest of his face. She felt the heat flood her cheeks as she realized the rudeness of her scrutiny. She opened her mouth to stammer something, anything out, that might make those anguished brown eyes blink at least. After the liberties she'd taken, and now the offensive way she'd looked at him, something inside her twisted sickeningly at the thought of her stare, adding to all the others he had surely endured in his life. But to her shock, a large, hot hand came up and gripped her outstretched one where it had dropped from his hair in her shock, and he lowered his disfigured face to it, closing his wet eyes and pressing them against her calloused palm. Cassara blinked, her mouth still open. She closed it. She stared at the back of his head, the pale skin of his neck through his unwashed hair. The temptation suddenly presenting itself was almost more than she could bear. Her palm burned where he touched it. Not with his feverishness, but with the awareness of his torment in such tantalizingly close reach. Just once, she thought, won't hurt. Just this once. But of course, that was a lie. It would hurt. It had to hurt, or she wouldn't have done it properly. But pain? What was that to her? She didn't enjoy it, certainly, but she could bear it better than this man could. Better than any man could, or woman for that matter. This was the dreadlord of Eladria, the only ruler she'd ever heard of who fought alongside his own men. That had to mean something. There are worse things, she thought, than hurrying along one's doom for a good cause. But was this really a good cause? How much did she really know about him? This was her life and her safety diminished for a headache. But he has such a big head, she thought helplessly. He started to lift that head, and before she could talk herself out of it, her other hand darted forward and laid against it. And she opened her senses to the thick, cold sensation of his pain and threw open the gate in her mind. The pain knifed through her skull instantly, pleased to be released into so receptive a vessel, feeling like a dull, hot blade driven through her eyes and out the back of her head. Bright spots blossomed in her vision, momentarily drowning out what little she could see in the pale light of the open door, hiding the massive man still kneeling next to her. Her own stomach lurched once, briefly, then settled. She drew a deep breath, blinking away the spots and steeling herself inwardly against the pain that now stabbed in her own head. It was probably the most painful headache she'd ever taken from another, she had to admit, but it was well within her abilities. It had taken but a bare moment to recover herself, and even now Lord Eladria's head snapped up, knocking her hand away, and he stared at her, those brown eyes now wide with obvious shock. He blurted out a confused question, his eyebrows knitting together, but for the life of her it made no sense. Oh no, is this headache addling my mind somehow? Sarah had never heard of such a thing. "I'm sorry, my lord?" Lord Eladria blinked at her and rose slowly to his feet. She watched him as if in a dream, her head tilting back to follow his progress as he unfolded with startling agility for one so immense. He was a veritable giant, and she wondered with a kind of awe about how he managed normal doorways. "What the hell did you just do?" he asked slowly, carefully enunciating each word. That was when her eyes fixed on his great misshapen mouth against her will, and she understood the previous difficulty. He clearly had to be careful in speech, with his mouth and jaw as they were. In his surprise, he'd spoken too quickly, and the result had been incoherent to her unsuspecting ears. She forced her head with great effort back to his, which also forced her to take a step back, given that her neck was not hinged. The fierce look she saw there made her shrink away still further. I helped, my lord?" she guessed, wringing her hands. He stared down at her expectantly. She blinked back at him with a perfectly schooled facade of blankness. Finally, he prompted, "When you touched me?" "Yes, my lord?" It still came out as a question. He sighed and shook his head slightly, the shoulder-length strands falling back into his face. The act seemed to remind him of something. "Go fetch one of my usual staff, girl," he said clearly, "and tell cook I will be down there to speak with her soon. She is to be ready for me." "Yes, my lord." She barely suppressed a smile of relief. She clumsily dropped a curtsy and fled, nearly impaling herself on something on her way to the door. The guards must have overheard somehow, for it opened at her approach, and she barely stopped herself from careening down the narrow stairs. She was blinded all at once by the sudden brightness of the tower outside, a brightness which made the pain in her head again explode. She paused to give herself a moment to adjust before she fell and broke her neck, the sudden implications of her earlier act only now catching up with her. "Just won't hurt me," she told herself firmly. "It's just a headache." And strangely, it did not appear that the Dreadlord had recognized her for what she was. He might not even know about the existence of her kind. That thought was actually a tremendous relief. Of course, it was only a matter of time before he started asking questions again. Probably coinciding with his next headache, she thought cynically. No, there was a slightly more urgent concern. How was she going to maintain the effect on him from a distance? She wasn't sure she could. In proximity, there was certainly no trouble, but as she moved away, could she make it as far as the kitchen before the temporary and fragile bond between them snapped? Only one way to know, she thought. Interiorly, she clutched at the tenuous connection between them, hugging the pain of his great pounding head to herself, and she began the long plod down the winding staircase. She could feel the connection like a bit of taffy in her mind, stretching thinner and thinner as she moved away. She was disappointed when it snapped into nothingness not even halfway down the tower, punctuated by a roar that reminded her vividly of a bear she heard once that had been disturbed during its winter sleep. It was a sound that cut through her, reminding her terribly of deep brown eyes pressing against her own rough palm, the wet brush of his eyelashes against her skin. Her head, of course, now felt fine, but she spun around and started back up, taking the steps two at a time, as fast as she dared. "What are you doing, you fool?" she screamed at herself as she hurried, her legs burning mercilessly. "Run! The other way! If you do this, I'll never let you go. I'll never leave you alone. Once could be a fluke, but twice?" Sarah ignored it. She fully expected to run face first into a soldier descending the stair to retrieve her, but no soldier came, and when she reappeared, panting at the landing, a flash of surprise was twinned on their faces. "Let me in," she huffed. Her throat and lungs burned horribly from the cold, damp air. "The Dreadlord has not summoned you," the guard who had addressed her before said firmly. "What business do you have here?" "Didn't you hear him just now?" she sputtered. "He needs help." "His lordship has always had the headaches," the guard said flatly, "but he manages. He has even led us to victory with one. But so good of a wee little Lietarin to be concerned." This last was accompanied by a slight sneer. Cassandra gritted her teeth. "Let me in," she ground out from between them, her hands curling into fists at her sides. The soldiers both saw this and laughed. "What are you going to do, chit?" the other mocked, grinning. "Smack us in the shins or bite our ankles?" His fellow guffawed. She knew she ought not to have done it, but before she could even stop herself, the memory of a blade being driven through her shoulder, no, not her shoulder, it was someone else's shoulder, seared itself across her mind. and into his. It spoke to the fortitude and constitution of Eladrian's soldiers that he only uttered a hoarse cry of shock rather than the scream that had been elicited from the actual injured, his hand flying up to his shoulder. The other soldier turned to him, visibly confused at what had just happened, as Cassera took her chances and sprinted between them. The only difficulty was, of course, the huge oaken door now barring her way. She was not even sure she could open it on her own, but she was counting on a certain individual being sensitive to sound. She pounded on it with both fists, screaming, "Let me in! I can help you!" at the top of her lungs. The soldiers quickly recovered themselves. She had not tried to maintain any connection to the one she'd wounded, and the pain was already gone. And she felt metal gauntleted hands close around her upper arms, lifting her onto her toes and dragging her away from the door to the top of the stair. The back of another such hand came up from her right and struck her, rattling her teeth and causing her to smell blood. I deserve this, she thought bitterly, feeling the warmth sliding down her upper lip. I could have died in my bed, but no. I'll die over the headache of some ungrateful noble who doesn't even know about me. Cassera flinched as she saw the hand come up again, screwing her eyes shut and bracing for the impact, when she was suddenly dropped. She landed hard onto the top stairs, no doubt pitied by some benevolent deity, for one of her hands struck the bottom edge of the railing where it met the stone, and she clung to it, stopping her fall. She heard the crash of metal and a muffled hissing that carried the imperious tone of an order. Cassera opened her eyes. Not an arm's length away stood the Dreadlord, squinting against the light and glaring murderously at her. One of the soldiers lay crumpled and twitching at his feet. The other stood against the wall nearest to her and reached down, again taking her by the arm and decisively pulling her onto the landing. Only at the last possible moment did Cassera relent and release the railing, knowing full well that her doom was assured, whether she was hanging on to it or not. She scrambled to get her feet beneath her, not that it mattered. The hand clenched around her arm held her up. "What are you about, girl?" Lord Eladria asked. The words were a little slurred, but she understood them. Well... Cassera suddenly felt foolish, and there was no time to debate with herself what to tell him or how much. "I wanted to help you," she finished lamely. "I had hoped I could keep it up from downstairs, but I couldn't." His lordship frowned, and she shuddered involuntarily. With his face, the expression was more of a terrifying caricature of displeasure than the usual innocuous gesture. If he noticed her reaction, he ignored it. "Did you get another servant to come up?" he asked. It took her a moment this time to translate mentally, but she flushed and mumbled, "Well, no, I came right back when I realized. Maybe you had better do that," he suggested with a dark look that made her cringe from within the soldier's grip. "You see, here I am lord, and I expect my servants to obey me. Not that this will be an issue with you much longer if you can't be bothered to follow simple instructions, to say nothing of assaulting one of my men." Cassera somehow managed a nervous little laugh. "Assaulting, my lord? What did I do, nay, what could I do to one of your men? They are twice my size, and they are twice as many." The frown somehow deepened, and the breath caught in Cassera's throat. "I don't know that yet, but you must have done something. They would never act against a woman without provocation." He bent a little at the shoulders, his eyes intently studying her face. "Though they did overreact. They will be disciplined." "Will be," Cassera thought, her eyes flicking against her will till the soldier crumpled on the floor. They darted back to him when she felt his fingers probing her cheek with the businesslike mien of a midwife. "Nothing broken," he said after a moment. "You are very fortunate." Somehow, she knew without having to be told that he was not addressing only her. His hand fell away, his fingertips dappled with bright crimson. Lord Eladria suddenly closed his eyes, and Cassera knew that the pain was beginning to him. She bit her lip, unsure of how to proceed. "My lord, I can help you, but only if I stay near you," she said. He lifted an eyebrow inquisitively, but his eyes stayed shut. "I don't need your help," he said finally. "I have always managed, and I know not what sorcery you called upon before. I will not have it in this keep, nor in this country." Despite the implied threat, his voice was merely tired. "It is no sorcery, my lord," Cassera said hesitantly. "I don't know how it happens, actually, but I'm almost entirely certain it isn't sorcery." "Almost entirely certain," Lord Eladria echoed, opening his eyes slightly to peer at her. "Well, I've heard theories, but I'm not sure how I feel about them. None of them have ever mentioned sorcery," she explained quickly. Then she clamped her mouth shut, worrying she had said too much. What if he asked about those theories, or where she had heard them from? But the Dreadlord simply gave a very slow shake of his head. "It is irrelevant," he said. "You're not to do it again." His tone left no room for argument, but no argument was in Cassera anyhow. He continued in slightly more subdued tones. "I understand you were trying to help, so I will allow you another chance in spite of—" He made a vague hand gesture that was apparently intended to cover everything, from the abominable liberties she'd taken to the perceived assault of his guards. "But there will not be another such chance. Now do as I have told you, girl." Cassera did not hesitate in dropping something akin to a curtsy and resuming her flight down the stairwell. Next scene. "It feels like knives," Thane, Dreadlord of Eladria, mused to himself. He was a man much experienced with blades, and it felt as though a dozen of them were skewering his brains unseen, still white-hot from the forge. Standing in the brightness of the landing had been excruciating, and he was suddenly sure, from where he now sat, ensconced in the comforting darkness, a fresh tea-tray, sans scones, before him, that he would not let the little foreign girl go if he'd been thinking clearly. Hell, if he had not been so desperate at the moment she'd first come upon him, he would not have, that is all. He could not bear now to even think of his childish behavior in that moment of weakness. It was not like him. He sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. He ought to have been more upset that some sort of dark sorcery may have been wrought upon his person without his consent, however temporarily. But all he could remember was the pure and overwhelming sense of relief. His headaches could last for days, and he had woken with this one already clutching him in its grasp. Every breath felt labored, every sound was amplified, and a fresh invisible knife in his head. Soon he knew the stabbing would resolve into mere pounding, and he would go out to the barracks, as was his habit, to train with his men. Not many leaders would fight or train with their troops. His own father would never have dreamed of such a thing. But Thane had grown up in their midst, had even gone to battle with them for the first time when scarcely into his teens. They were more his family than his blood relations had ever been, and he would have given his life for any one of them. Now he was left to worry about the threat the foreign girl presented, if any. He always kept his word, and having given her another chance, he meant to do so. But he thought he should have someone keep an eye on her. It did not seem likely that she was present to work mischief if she had tried to help him, though of course that help could have been mischief all on its own for all he knew. It was unfortunate, but they knew little of what passed for sorcery and witchcraft, and had no interest in learning. Strategy, war, those were different matters, as were the sciences he's dabbled in when he had time of his own. But forces he could not see and weigh and reckon with, powers that could not be held at the edge of his favorite battle axe, he had neither time nor interest for, had in fact nothing but a surplus of distrust. And he felt perfectly justified in that distrust. Take this moment, for example, he thought to himself, settling back in his chair and wrapping his hands around an earthenware mug. That girl did something to take the pain away, and now that it has returned to me, it feels worse than it did before because of the reprieve. He snorted. And what had she done? She had touched the back of his head. He frowned at the memory. Perhaps she had simply taken advantage of a pressure point or some such thing to alleviate his pain. He had heard of healers who believed pressing various places on the body somehow righted the living energy within that person. Such ideas were certainly on the questionable list in Thane's mind, but he could not deny he had felt absolute relief. Perhaps it was an effect that wore off quickly, which is why she had come back, why she had needed to see him again. That was not, he thought, with some hope, sorcery. It was science, if one he could not claim much understanding of. His own interests lay in quite a different direction. Still, he thought, it's a good theory. He lifted his hand to the back of his head and tried to press where she had, but it had no effect on the stabbing. Of course, he was not trained to it, he reasoned, and perhaps she was. Perhaps there was a trick to it. And of course, she'd not be likely to share it, not when it could secure her a position in the keep of the Dreadlord, but then why not apply as a healer rather than a maid? It made little sense to him. The idea that she never would have been considered for such a position given her alien status teased at the edges of his mind, but he dismissed it. He knew there was prejudice against foreigners. Hell, he felt the very same way as the rest of his kinsmen on the subject. But when presented with the evidence of it in its more practical applications, he could not bring himself to acknowledge it. Thane could recognize this fact about himself, but preferred not to think any more about it. In all honesty, he personally would have hired a Lintaran if it meant his people would benefit from such an action, and he was sure the corresponding risk could be mitigated, and his feelings for that particular country were well known. But Thane had made his decision and rolled that die. He would give his instructions to cook when he'd finished his tea, and the dire consequences would just have to wait. He lifted his mug, noticing for the first time the stickiness of his fingers. The girl was lucky, he thought. He still didn't know what she had supposedly done. His men were not one for making excuses for themselves. But something inside him protested to see a woman struck. He'd seen far too much of that in his life. Then something occurred to him, something strange. He set down the mug and rubbed his fingers together thoughtfully. She had been bleeding. No broken bones, of course, but a nosebleed and a bruised cheek. He had pressed her cheekbone and jaw firmly to inspect them, and she had not even reacted, had not even blinked. Eladries were known for their stoicism. But her breathing hadn't even faltered. It was just odd. Then, too, he had heard her knocking into the furniture fairly hard when she had entered the outer room, but she had not gasped or cursed or cried out like a normal person. Another sort of sorcery, he wondered, his brows knitting together, but no, that made no sense. There was only so much that could be blamed on the dark arts. He had never heard of being impervious to pain as a fruit of sorcery. And was she really impervious or simply resistant? It could be natural. Perhaps all her countrymen were like this. That thought only made him darken. This was something he needed to establish for strategic reasons. One never knew what enemies the future might bring, and one who would fight heedless of pain would be formidable indeed. Thane drank down the last of his tea and rose to wash and dress. There was much that needed doing. He could only hope he'd not made a mistake by letting the girl leave him freely. He supposed he ought to have been reassured that she had done as he told her first, but a clever mind would have done that anyway to buy themselves more time. Of course, nothing she had done so far had convinced him that she qualified as clever. Certainly, if he'd left her to the consequences of her own foolhardy behavior, her fellow servants would be trying to scrape her off the stairwell by now. After performing his usual ablutions, he descended the stairs and made his way through the keep down the kitchen. It was not unusual to see his lordship in any particular part of the keep. He had no sense of propriety in that regard, and no eyebrows were raised, though plenty of bodies were bent in signs of respect as he passed. He barely took them in, working instead on keeping his stride steady and purposeful when his eyes were beginning to water at his brightly daylit surroundings, and his head was now pounding in time to his footfalls. At length Thane ducked through the door into the kitchen. It was a massive, sprawling conglomeration of flagged and cobbled stone, and to Cook's unfailing pride and the consternation of his aching head, every one of those stones somehow managed to shine. There were pots and bowls on every conceivable surface, and bundles of herbs hanging from the ceiling around the perimeter of the room. A thick bundle of sage almost smacked him in the face as he entered. Servants bustled in non-stop motion, not even appearing to take notice of him, or more terrified of earning Cook's displeasure than his. He would not have been surprised if this were the case. Cook herself, a tall, big-boned woman well into middle-age, with graying brown hair pinned tightly up and tucked under a white cap to match her apron, stood with all the presence of the High Lord in the midst of the proceedings. Her keen eyes took in everything, and her tongue was as perpetually in motion as the kitchen servants, driving them on. Between that continuous monologue and the normal clatter of pots and pans, Thane thought the place to be quite a fair match to any battlefield he'd fought on when it came to his survival. "Best turn that hair. If it scorches, you'll be the one on the spit next," Cook hissed to one hapless maidservant. She then spun as though mysteriously sensing some disruption on the smooth running of her domain, mouth already open to rebuke the intruder before she quickly snapped it shut, stiffening a moment before dropping into what Thane was certain was supposed to be a curtsy. "My lord, dear me, I am so sorry." The woman's face reddened, a normal sight in her anger, but Thane had a suspicion that it was not anger turning it into that tomato hue now. Grant had told him long ago that Cook would have been ecstatic to be the next Lady Eladria, even with his obvious deficiencies. The thought filled him with embarrassment. It was not uncommon in his country for the reigning lord to take whoever they wished to wife, whether commoner or noble. Even diplomatic marriages were unusual, which was not all that surprising when one considered the typical Eladrian xenophobia that had been the punchline of many a joke in the High Lord's court. He could not begin to grasp what Cook's interest in him would be, though, apart from the obvious promotion she'd receive from such a marriage. Thane answered Cook's greeting with a polite nod of his head, instantly regretting it as pain flared afresh in the base of his skull. He tried to curve his lips slightly in what he privately called his court smile, which very carefully showed no teeth. He had spent a rather humiliating amount of time perfecting it in his younger years. "Good day to you, Cook," he murmured politely. "I was hoping for a word." "Of course, my lord," Cook said, smiling a little too widely. "That girl told me you'd be coming." Thane lifted a brow. "So she can follow instructions. Remarkable." Cook's red hue deepened, and she suddenly scowled. "Usually she follows them a little too well, actually, my lord," she said in conspiratorial tones. "But let us go into the dining room if you wish, my lord, so we can speak without this rabble about." Thane gave another, far more subdued nod and followed her through a set of doors into the smaller of the two dining rooms in the keep. This one was supposed to be for what was termed family dining, featuring seating for merely 16. The rows of empty chairs seemed to mock his failure at domestic entanglements, and he barely suppressed an answering scowl at them. Like every room of the keep, the kitchen included, this one was a study in stone, but the heavy carpets, long since faded into a uniform pale gray that matched the floor beneath, muffled the sound of their steps, and the walls were covered with family portraits. These were stiffly posed affairs of relatives that were long dead before his time. They smiled uncomfortably from within their heavy gilt frames, most of them red-haired, all of them large, and none of them deformed. Sensing his own losing battle with his scowl, he took a deep breath and turned his attention back to Cook. She was looking around the room and wringing her hands. "Oh, ought I have a fire laid, my lord? There's such a chill in the air. I ought to have thought of it before you came," she said, sounding annoyed. No, it's fine. This will not take long, Cook," he said. He had not even noticed the cold. It was a rare day when he did. "I wanted to speak with you about the servant who brought my tea this morning. The first time, I mean." Cook stared at him expectantly. He cleared his throat slightly and continued, "Well, what exactly was she doing there? I thought my feelings were clear on this subject." His voice remained quiet, but Cook still paled. Of course he had been clear. There were only certain servants who attended him in his private chambers. He was a creature of routine, and those who were accustomed to his face tended not to react so much to it. It was nice to not be gawped at like a beast on display in his own home. He could hardly help it elsewhere. "My lord," Cook said at last, "I do know your feelings, and I am most sorry for the intrusion. I will of course dismiss the girl." "Why?" he interrupted. "You sent her to me, did you not? Would you have retained her if she'd refused your order?" Cook went paler still. "It is only that, my lord. Well, I've been trying to get that girl out of this house," she said feebly. Again he raised his eyebrow, and she hastened on. "We had to hire her for want of any other help when the Yogg passed through, only now, well, there's no easy way to cut this foreigner loose. We're none of us comfortable with her about. I was at my wit's end." She paused for a moment, flustered under his scrutiny. "But I ought to have found another way that would not disturb his lordship. I was not thinking aright. I am so very sorry, my lord. It will not happen again." "It is not like you to think wrong," Thane observed. Cook made a choking noise that might have been a laugh. "No, indeed, my lord. The chit made me that mad, and I don't lie." He tried to look sympathetic, or rather, the way he imagined people probably looked when showing sympathy, which involved somehow squinching his eyebrows and downturning the corners of his mangled mouth just a bit. He was out of his depth on this one, and Cook's quickly suppressed shudder was all the proof that he needed. However, his effort was still rewarded with the desired effect. "Every day, my lord, that girl comes into my kitchen for her orders, knowing plain well how we all feel about her," Cook said in a rush. "I'm beginning to feel as if she just shows up to irritate me. See how long she can mallinger here. Well, I won't be made sport of by some little foreign upstart." Thane sacrificed a sage nod, but she is satisfactory in the completion of her duties. "She does what I tell her, yes." Reluctance was written in every line of the woman's face. "She does it well?" Thane pressed. "Well enough." "And so you had to resort to defying your lord to be rid of her." Cook looked away from him, suddenly nervous. "As I said, my lord, I was not thinking right," she said meekly. "Clearly not," he said, his voice staying quiet. Cook shifted her weight from one side to the other, now intently studying one edge of the old carpet. "You surely did not think I would take care of your little foreign problem for you," he continued. He saw by the sudden return of the redness in her cheeks that yes, she had expected exactly that, but she stammered a barely coherent protest. "I enforce the laws of our people, Cook, and under law, this girl, however objectionable to you in temperament, has done nothing. But you have conspired to kill her, is it not so? And to lure your lord into such an unjust act on your behalf, knowing so well my frailty." As if to remind her of this, he tapped two fingers lightly against the side of his skull. It was laughable to use a word like frailty in relation to his immense hulking self, and he knew it. But he also knew Cook was far from laughing at the moment. "Not kill her, my lord, only put her out," Cook insisted pleadingly. Her hand-wringing had taken on a frantic character. "You know she'd never be here if not for that Ogg. It is a disgrace to have an alien working here when there is no longer need of her. There are kinsmen looking for work who would be better served." "The law," was all he said. Cook swallowed hard. Dread her lord may be, but not unjust. Never that. After a long moment of tense silence, he continued gently, now that she has been hired, whatever the reason behind that, she cannot be dismissed without just cause. I am not to see her in my chambers again unless I request for her to be there, nor any other I have not approved. Moreover, since she is an alien to whom you have raised objection, Cook, I would have her watched carefully for now. She looked up at him suddenly, saucer-eyed with surprise. He shrugged one shoulder. It is a precaution. Perhaps you are not amiss in your suspicion of her. We will soon know. Oh, thank you, my lord, Cook said, and though her gratitude seemed sincere, it was also subdued, a certain wariness in her eyes. I will give you the honor of telling your second of her promotion and my orders, Thane said casually. He had not thought it possible for her eyes to further widen, but widen they did as she blanched. He added, the penalty for what you've tried to do is actually quite a bit steeper, but as I completely understand your sentiments where this particular servant is concerned, I am inclined to leniency. By the look on Cook's face now, Thane thought he'd probably just lost his only marriage prospect. And that is the first two scenes from Chapter 1 of Broken Mirrors, Book 1 of the Broken Mirrors duology. Ordering information will be in the description below. I hope you enjoyed it. And I think that's it for this one. So thank you very much for tuning in and listening. And if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them for me in the comments. Thanks so much.